Okay, so it looks like we are live now. I'm Jane Prisby. I'm the director of the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina. And I just want to welcome you all to our monthly Facebook Live Quilt Documentation Day. The second Saturday of the month at 11 o'clock a.m., we gather together to talk about quilts and quilt history. So today's program is going to be a little bit different from prior programs. In the past, we have tended to focus mostly on historical quilts. And today we are experimenting with a new software that will allow me to host guests on the program. And today our guests are going to be Denise Lau and Jerry Griggs. I apologize in advance if there are some glitches because anytime you try a new software program, you have to work through the glitches. But we hope you'll bear with us and that being able to listen to and hear the stories of people other than me, the talking head, will make this program really more interesting for you and more informative. Now, when I first met Denise and Jerry, because they came to the first Quilt Documentation Day at the museum before we closed due to COVID. And they had brought historical quilts that the two of them had collected. And then since then, Jerry, her husband, took the liberty of sending me some images of the quilts that he herself had made in the last quarter of the 20th century, the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. And when I looked at the quilts that Denise made, I just thought, I saw them as representing not only the quilts, and the stories of a particular family, her family, their family, but as having been part of a larger movement. The quilt revival that really kicked up in the last quarter of the 20th century, I would say, was indeed a movement. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to situate the story of Denise and Jerry and their quilts within the larger picture of what was going on back then. And I'm hoping that doing this will inspire those of you who did get involved with quilting back in the 70s and 80s to actually send me images of the quilts you made back then, along with your origin stories. Now, origin stories, I find that most people who make quilts have one. How I made my first quilt, how I came to make my first quilt. Some are complicated than others, but I think they're interesting stories because they often contain a seed that continues to inspire them to make more quilts and share them with their families and friends. So, so the structure of today's program is different from before. We will be hearing first from Denise Lau. She preferred doing an audio recording as we share images from her life and her quilts. And then we will talk with Jerry live to have a conversation with us about, what he learned from Denise over the years and his involvement in not only in some ways partnering with her and collaborating in some ways on the quilts, but his involvement with the collecting part too. And finally, again, if there's time, time will fly, I'm going to suggest how Quilt's story fits into this bigger story of the late 20th century quilt making revival. So before we hear from Denise, I want to thank the South Carolina Arts Commission. They have awarded the McKissick Museum a Folklife Partnership Grant, which is part of what makes this show possible. And I want to thank Amanda Ballou. She's our communications manager, and she is the Wizard of Oz of this show. She is behind the curtain, pulling the levers, making sure that this all comes off. So I wanted to thank Amanda. And again, let's get on with the show.
Well, looking back at our family, sewing was just always around for my mom's family and for me when I was growing up. My grandparents immigrated from Okinawa in the late 1920s, and my mom grew up during the war years. She had a family of 8 brothers and sisters. There were 5 girls and 3 boys. So they were raised on a small farm, and there was always a need to clothe them. And Hawaii at that time, in the 1930s or so, there weren't, fabric stores, there weren't dress stores, there weren't department stores, anything like that. I think what they did have was something called a dry goods store, and that's where they would buy fabric, because it was probably more economical to ship bolts of fabric to Hawaii. And also at that time, we know that girls in school, they had to wear dresses. So I remember looking at one of my aunt's dresses that I found in my grandmother's closet. It was quite an elaborate dress. It had a matching fabric belt and matching fabric buttons and a full waist. And I just thought, wow, this is so dressy and so much more elaborate than what kids wear to school today. And my grandmother, I remember she had a foot-pedaled Singer sewing machine, and it made a sweet clackety noise when she used it. She herself didn't sew that much, but she used to save fabric rice bags and cut them up to be used as dishcloths. And she would sew on a border of scrap fabric. And I remember her doing that. And in my own home that I grew up, my mom had a very futuristic looking 1960s Singer sewing machine that she was too busy to use, but it was around, so I asked her about it, and she showed me how to do a running stitch by hand and how to do a blind hem, and then later on thread the machine and actually use it. And I remember those times very fondly because she was sharing something with me, and I learned a lot about my family because we would just sit and talk about her family. Where did I buy my fabric from? Well, since I was in middle school and high school, I was limited to where I could go. I didn't have a car, or I didn't know how to drive. So I walked around the historic part of the town. And in those days, we weren't so worried about being abducted or anything like that. So I was able to, walk wherever I wanted to. And one place I went to was called Hata's Fabric Store. It's on the Bayfront area of town. It was built in 1912. It's a masonry building, and it was built by Japanese immigrants. And at the time, it was a pretty big thing because most buildings were made out of wood. So this one was made, it was built strong, and in fact, it withstood a tsunami to my hometown in 1960, a tsunami that destroyed the other side of the street that this building is on. And this store in particular, I would buy nicer pieces of fabric. The other store was a crest store, which had a lovely Art Deco exterior, and it had a soda fountain that was working when I was there in the mid-70s, although it was very slow. We were able to get ice cream floats and patty melts and things like that. And Crest had cheaper grades of fabric. One summer I went to a summer sewing school. It was in a dressmaker's house, actually in her basement. I went for maybe once a week for a couple hours for maybe 2 months. And in her basement, she had these long tables with sewing machines. And I would pick out something I wanted to sew from a McCall's or Simplicity pattern book, and she was actually able to draft the pattern for me. She drew out the pattern with a pencil and very long rulers and some sort of curved ruler, and she drew it on this paper, this plain brown paper, and I would cut it out and sew it. And those clothes I wore throughout middle school and parts of high school. I was sort of envious of other girls who were able to purchase their clothes, just store-bought clothes, very quickly, and they were more trendy. And I was always wearing homemade clothing, and I kind of cringed at the time. But looking back now, I'm really glad that I learned how to sew, because sewing has been like a gateway skill for me. It has so many foundational skills that you can use for other crafts. So I no longer regret my homemade clothing. So because I learned to be thrifty in my family, and also from the cultural influences I was seeing in the 1970s, being a pioneer spirit and back to the earth movement and not to waste too much, I had a stash of fabric that I would save from all my fabric sewing projects. I wanted to do something with them. And then when I saw, maybe I could make a quilt, a scrap quilt, I thought that would be a great idea. I had seen quilts from the Depression era, and I was particularly impressed by them. I liked the fact that, they made do with what they had. Their choices were limited, but that wasn't so bad, because I think their quilt fabrics they have a lot of energy to them. They're not so static. They're more spontaneous, because they're using fabrics that, have a life outside of the quilt. They might have come from clothing they wore, or, it might bring back memories of a special occasion, a special person, maybe a trend in fabric, or just, bring back memories. So a scrap quilt would be, almost like a scrapbook of your life. So with that in mind, I decided to go ahead and try to do a scrap quilt of my own, and that's why I made this flying geese quilt. Looking at the flying geese now, I'm kind of embarrassed by how amateurish it looks. It's not perfectly sewn, and the color choices are pretty bad. The combinations don't work, but yet it's the most loved quilt in our family. And when I look at it now, it brings back so many memories and connections that I had at that time of life when I was in middle school and high school. I have fabric in that quilt. I wore clothing to work, and a piece of that's in the fabric. I have a piece of Hawaiian fabric that I made from a top that I wore when I first came to South Carolina on the airplane trip. I have pillows that I made, the fabrics in there. It's just like a scrapbook. It reminds me of the kind of fabric choices I used to like. So I love calicos, maybe not so much now, but it's just like a tactile connection to the past that I can look at, I can touch, and I can wrap it around my family members who have all used the quilt really so much that I've had to mend it several times. Pieces of fabric have become tattered. I've had to cover them completely over again. So this quilt has been just a part of our family lives. And, it's something that you can't buy at Kmart. It can't be made in China. And even the handwork that I've done, you can almost feel the work that I've done comes through to the person using the quilt. I subscribe to the Quilters Newsletter magazine. That magazine caught my eye in particular because it seems so technical. magazine articles on quilts seemed more about the history and more maybe about the romance of quilting, while this magazine was it had very clear, concise, and full instructions on how to make a quilt, and it didn't have many ads. There were many quilts patterns in one issue, and they're like keepsakes. I still have a stack of them from like the mid 80s that I still hold on to, and I made at least 2 or 3 quilts from the magazine. For Malia's quilt, it's just something I quickly did, but I just wanted to bring up that she's coming from a multicultural background, ancestry, and so I used a more of an exotic print in her pattern, but the design is sort of based on an Amish quilt pattern, and yeah. I really only took one formal quilting class, and this was in the mid 80s. It was through the USC continuing education classes. I took it from a lady named Hazel Ross. I thought at the time that she was a quilt pioneer in Columbia. I don't know this for sure, but she seemed very old school to me. She was very particular and precise on how a quilting stitch should look, how even and regular the stitches should be. I think she was more focused on the technical aspects more than the design aspects of the quilt, but I think I learned to take quilting more seriously from her. She was very stern in a way, but she did teach me an interesting technique, which is to make a large quilt by quilting each block individually, and later on you assemble them block by block, already quilted. First you sew the quilt top together, then you turn over, and then you turn under the seams of the quilt backing, and that was supposed to enable you to quilt, on the go, rather than having to need a large quilting hoop. And yeah, I still think about her once in a while, and I think that she taught me a lot of good basics. Well, the Valley of Quilting in our family. I think it teaches us to value things that are handmade, things that are visually beautiful and striking, and also that quilting can be, comforting, something to wrap around yourself. It can be a way to express an idea, such as Jerry's Fibonacci quilt. It comes from an idea that he might have read about, and he asked me to make a quilt based on it. So I did that for him, and it's a quilt that shows his interests and a love of abstract ideas. And I guess there are things that you could hand down and hang up and display for other people to see. But, the process itself is very calming and comforting, and it's like a refuge for me, the meditative quality of quilting, quilting a stitch in and out, and just a symbol of home, I guess, is what a quilt, symbolizes or means to us as a family. And I don't know, Malia has been surrounded by quilts, so I think she might have developed an eye, for fine stitch work. And I think that's good because it teaches you to notice details in life or in anything you do. And I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, it's a way to appreciate things that you might take for granted.
Well, thank you, Denise. It was wonderful to hear from you about your quilts, And now I think we're going to bring Jerry on board live, if possible, to talk about your collecting. Hey, Jerry, how are you?
Hi, nice to see you. Great.
Good to see you too. Again, I was struck when I met you and Denise at how the two of you are such a team, it seems like, with regards, first to the collecting, because when I first met you, you had been sharing the historical quilts that the two of you had collected together. And then you shared with me her quilts. And clearly you have a relationship with some of them, I gathered from talking with both of you at this point. So can you tell me a little bit about how you first got interested in collecting quilts?
Okay, well, just the history. I had been teaching in Hawaii. That's where we met each other. And then I moved to University of South Carolina in 81. And I was thinking, my office has been in LeConte, which is about a long Frisbee throw away from McKissick, where you are. Um, Denise transferred over in 1982, and then we got married the next year, 83. So it was soon after that that she started these quilt. High quilt doesn't have the stitching, but as she described and what we heard, she took classes and things. So I was impressed by the precision required do the hand quilting well, so somehow I learned to look at that in quilts. We like going to the state fair every year, and we would see the quilts and admire them. So I encouraged her to enter this one quilt. I don't really understand. It's magical to me how these patterns are on the quilt, but she entered this quilt she made when I was on a semester up in Minnesota, the Poppy's quilt, and then we were astonished that that won the sweepstakes award because it wasn't, a modern, the more modern quilt style, the serious art. People get special fabrics made for quilts, and the special patterns. She made more of a traditional quilt, but very nice work. That's it there. So that was exciting. And then the quilt for our daughter, she made a baby quilt. That was one that was Amish inspired. We entered that as a child item, and that won sweepstakes against Afghans and other items made for children. So that was fun. I wanted to mention that I kept entering photographs I took that I liked, and I never got a single ribbon or anything. Denise did so well. Anyway, I collect old postcards and other things, so I like going to antique malls. There are not so many anymore, but would look, and if I saw quilts, I was admiring the vintage quilts. I love besides the geometry, I love the geometry. I'm a mathematician, so the symmetries and patterns are fun. But the vintage fabrics are charming, and I just always imagine the quilter putting all this thought and heart into it and just using what fabric was around that Denise described. So sometimes there's an oddball fabric in one corner, and that's fine with us. But sometimes they seem undervalued. So if I could get one and I could afford it and it seemed reasonable, so I would buy one now and then. So we have a little collection of them, but I think we've only added one in the last 10 or 15 years. I don't look online for them or anything, but if I'm in a antique shop or something, I always check what they have. But we love. There are other ones that we really love, but just we can't afford. There's a style Hawaiian quilting. They're beautiful, but those cost a small fortune out in Hawaii. So even though Denise is from Hawaii, we don't have any examples of that. We did go up to Amish country early on, I think in the 80s, maybe, saw quilts there. So I think that partly inspired several of the quilts that Denise made in a more of an Amish style. So she's the real artist. The other thing I wanted to add was that I get to help in the design sometimes. So in the poppy quilt, making the decision for the wavy pattern around the border, I used sine waves from trigonometry and decided how the period went, how close together the rises and falls would be, so it would fit just right. There's one quilt top that we have that she did much earlier, and I helped with blocks going into the pattern. That's the one that's behind me there on blue and yellow. So I've had some input. There's one quilt that you showed the Fibonacci in flight that I took a pattern, I think, from a math paper. That one, there's this sequence. A lot of people know about it. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Each number is the sum of the two before it. Shows up a lot in nature. And then there's this beautiful pattern in the plane using the numbers in the sequence. So she made this great quilt. It's like a checkerboard, except the side lengths are growing with the sequence. But then, because I love birding more than anything, she put birds into it as well. So I do have some input in that way into the process.
Well, it sounds like in some ways you've been, if it's in your means and affordable, you've been kind of rescuing these works of art that you have found in antique malls and various and sundry other places, because you recognize the value of the work and the design that went into them.
That's right. Of course, to me, that's my excuse when I buy one that I'm rescuing it. But it's really for selfish reasons. We just love them. Compared to we have nice things on our walls, but they're not tactile. You just look at them. But love feeling the quilts. It's hard to go to a show like at McKissick, and I can't handle them. We can't have everybody handling them, leaving oils on them. I'm dying to touch them and feel the stitches, and we love having them on the bed, sleeping under them. We have these pets, so the pets wouldn't work out too well on top of the vintage quilt, so we don't do that very often. But using them for what they're made for. So we hope to pass them on to our daughter. At the beginning, you had a picture of Denise with our daughter, now grown up, and watching the broadcast from New York. There she is. So that's Malia.
That's a great picture.
She wrote that she wasn't aware that there was this baby quilt, but then I think we were kind of hanging on to it. So Denise made her a special wall hanging quilt based on her going to the Governor's School for the Arts. She's a creative writer, so she has this lovely wall hanging. There's one other comment, Denise, that I didn't mention. That's interesting is that she feels she got kind of bored just making grid lines and quilting. So in her recent work, she's freehanding the quilting pattern and the curves. So she's finding that freedom quite interesting and exciting. She's doing that that's the plan with this quilt top when she quilts it, the one that she made.
Well, again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the two of you coming to that first day and then continuing to be in communication with me about the bigger story, apart from the collecting, but the fact that Denise herself was part of what I'm calling a movement. And I would even, I mean, people might disagree with me, and they are welcome to do this, but there was kind of, again, in the latter part of the 20th century, I would suggest that the whole quilting revival was in some ways a women's movement that that was about really taking quilts seriously for the first time. I mean, it was interesting that that Denise talked about Hazel Ross, having her take quilting seriously. I think there were a lot of people in the 70s and 80s who decided that it was time, to take quilts seriously. And the bigger context of that, and Denise mentioned this in her talk, and when we spoke personally, she said how there were a lot of hippies in Hawaii, and that that whole back to the land, kind of a DIY, do it yourself instinct that the establishment hippies were living off the grid and trying to make their own clothes and were anti-materialistic and always trying to recycle things and salvage things, and that was a big influence on a lot of people who, especially on the West Coast, and I would say Hawaii too, because Hawaii is close to the West Coast, that was a big influence on how and why quilting became so popular later on in that last quarter of the 20th century. The other things that, again, Denise talked about that link to this bigger movement are Quilters Newsletter magazine. So Quilters Newsletter magazine was founded by Bonnie Lehman in 1969, and she lived in Colorado. She had a big family, and she aspired to be a writer. Yes. And she saw what was happening around her in terms of women being interested in quilts and quilt patterns and quilt history. And so she was very entrepreneurial, and she founded this magazine that I too subscribed to for many years, because it was sort of like, it was kind of a Bible, in terms of how to, but also it did have some articles about what was happening then. In particular, articles by Jean Ray Laurie, who was a California quilt artist, who got her master's degree in art at Stanford, and her master's thesis was a baby quilt she made for her son. So she was a very big influence, not only in California, but through the Quilters Newsletter magazine, nationally. The other things that happened that were really critical, and when I saw the Amish-inspired quilts that Denise made, well, it's interesting that you actually went to Amish country, because certainly if you all went there, that was a source of inspiration, perhaps. But also, Amish quilts that aesthetic became very popular among quilters because of a landmark exhibition that happened at the Whitney Museum of Art in 1971. Jonathan Holstein and Gail Vanderhoof had collected 19th century quilts, and a lot of them Amish quilts, which were made not with calico fabrics, but with solid wool fabrics and quilted immaculately. So they were visually abstract in the two-dimensional realm, but then in the three-dimensional realm, highly sculptural. It was an exhibit that was called Abstract Design in Quilts. And what that exhibit did was it took quilts off the beds and put them onto walls for the first time. So I don't know, many of you may recall more recently the Gee's Ben quilt exhibition that was at the Fine Art Museum in Houston. And basically it did the same thing, took a group of quilts that were very abstract and took them off for which they were made and put them on the wall and then redefined them as examples of modern art. And so that exhibit was, again, very transformative. And so Amish quilts and Amish quilt patterns and Amish quilt colorings using solid fabrics and darker fabrics, colors became very, very popular during that time. And in response to it, In 1973, a New York-based art historian named Patricia Minardi wrote a book, or an article. It wasn't really a book. It was a very important essay in a very short-lived journal called the Feminist Art Journal. So in winter 1973, she wrote an article that I would say still stands up today as one of the key events of the quilt revival, and a key challenge to us even still now, many decades later, called Quilts, the Great American Art. And she basically makes the case that, most art in early North America was very European derived, and that quilting and quilts really became the first uniquely American art to thrive in North America. And again, it's a powerful challenge to the art historical community and canon. Um, some people have made it into the canon. Quilts by Faith Ringgold, for example, have made it. Femage quilts by Miriam Shapiro have made it into the art canon. But by and large, the quilt history has remained separate from art history, which is kind of too bad. But I think it's a process, right? And so this program is part of that process. Denise mentioned Hazel Ross, which it was really nice to know that the University of South Carolina's continuing education program was part of this movement also. So Hazel, I looked her up. She is still with us. She was a continuing education, quilt teacher from 1974 to 1992. And she is, her claim to fame is a quilt that she quilted using this lap quilt technique that Denise talked about, doing one square at a time. She worked with about 150 volunteers, and they made a 25 by 25 foot quilt called Community Life to promote community education. And it's now in the collection of the South Carolina State Museum. So Hazel, thank you. I mean, every quilt community has their movers and shakers and people who were, really anchors and seriously dedicated to this movement. And Hazel, I think, was one of them. And then the last big historical, I think, movement moment that really gave quilting a real kick forward was the bicentennial, because with the bicentennial, women in particular were looking back to their colonial foremothers and imagining, how they participated in public life, and they reinvigorated this notion of our thrifty colonial foremothers, and of quilting as a salvage craft, which it certainly was to some extent, although in the period, before 1800, most quilts in North America were whole cloth quilts. They were not pieced. But as the 19th century wore on, you do get more scrap quilts that clearly women were repurposing fabrics left over from other clothing, curtains, whatever they had. And so the bicentennial, again, was an occasion for many women to get together and make quilts to commemorate the bicentennial, to form quilt guilds, which became a very important force in the revival of quilt making in the last quarter of the 20th century. And in fact, in 1977, so 1 year after the bicentennial, the San Jose Museum of Quilts was founded in San Jose, California. Again, odd that where the museum was founded because of the 1960s Back to the Land movement, the hippies there, they were at the forefront of founding a quilt museum. Then in 1980, a group called the American Quilt Study Group was founded by a librarian, Sally Garut, also in California. And that was the first really coming together of a group of women who felt that quilts had been left out of the scholarly canon. I mean, nobody was studying quilts, from a serious scholarly point of view. So that organization took up the baton on behalf of quilts and still exists today and publishes some of the best symposium papers, proceeds, that you will find on quilt history and quilt scholarship. So coming back to, where we are now, after these groups were founded in California, the Kentucky Quilt Project kicked off in 1981. And it was the first statewide quilt documentation project. And then in 1984, 4 under the direction of South Carolina's own Laurel Horton, who still lives up in Seneca, South Carolina. McKissick Museum undertook the second statewide quilt documentation project. So we were really at the forefront of taking quilts and women who made quilts seriously, and making sure that we documented that history and have that in our folk life. So this particular program, Quilt Documentation Days, is a continuation of that. I mean, that effort, was a time-specific effort, but we are reigniting it because we feel like at this point, again, decades have passed, right? And a lot of people have made more quilts since then. A lot of people have collected more historical quilts since then. And it's an opportunity for us to kind of take the temperature of what's going on in quilts